All right, we're back. It's COMP125. That's client-side web development here at Centennial, and it's, my God, week 10 of our program, right? And we're quickly going to the final exam, which is going to be on week 14. This is when we're going to have it in this particular course. We're going to build something on that day, a little application, and we're probably going to use an API, right? So let's talk about what we're building this week. This week's all around Ajax and JSON. Next week, we're going to do jQuery, right? So we're going to do a little bit of Ajax and JSON this week. Let's talk about that. I'm going to start with our code from lesson 9. Here's lesson 9. I'm just going to duplicate this. Okay, I didn't mean to do that. I'm going to duplicate this. Let's duplicate it. Not compress. I pressed compress by accident. So when we duplicate it, we're going to make it lesson 10, like we always do. And like I said before, you'd be fascinated to know that they still haven't fixed, if I'm not wrong, this problem with drag and drop for Visual Studio Code. So remember that you need to open up. So you have to go File, Open, and then maybe they won't. Maybe this is just a design choice for them. But if I go to COMP125 lesson 10, that's the one I want. There we go. Okay, so I've got lesson 10 here. And I need to strip out the Git credentials. So I'm going to open up a terminal window like we normally do. One of the questions I got recently was, so why are you showing them how to do Git? And Git has nothing to do with JavaScript, right? You shouldn't teach them, Git. Who cares? Just saying, right? I don't know how you guys feel about it. Should I just not talk about Git anymore? I'm just saying. Huh? But I'm saying, should I not talk about it? I mean, it's here's why I think it's important. This is a.
I need to learn Git.
Sure, you need to learn Git. Everyone needs to learn Git. Everyone needs to know about Git, GitHub, command line. Everyone who's a developer. There's got to be at some point in your life as a developer, you need to use the command line. If you're afraid to do it, maybe you're in the wrong business. But let's suppose I want to get rid of my repository. Again, I'm on a Mac. I'm going to rm-rf for remove force recursively. And I'm going to do my git repository.git. And now I'm going to initialize it in a second. But first, I want to make a few changes. In my README file, I want to change this to lesson 10, like we've talked about before. And we're not manipulating data in strings anymore. Let's bring up our PowerPoint presentation here for this one. Again, this should be up online for you guys. I put it up last week. So this is all around, like I said to you before, Ajax and JSON. So we're going to talk about those kind of things. Ajax is good. It's a really cool, way of accessing information from files. Okay, more than anything else. So let's say I want to get information from, an XML document or an HTML document. Or I want to reload the part of the page, but not the whole page. You can use Ajax for that. And so this is going to be yet another. This is going to be another tool in your toolbox, right? Another tool in your toolbox that we're going to be using, right? All right. So let me just replace this. I'll take page of Ajax. Let's get rid of this comment. That was just the one we were collaborating with last week. Okay, so updating page with Ajax. And also in our index.html, notice we've just let the other pages kind of slide, the other contact pages and so on, because we've been just making examples with the little tools we've been showing, right? So this is lesson 10. That's the other position we have to change. Change this over here. Right, and even our bower.json also says lesson 9. We change this to lesson 10. So these are all the changes I'm making to the file, right? 3.3.6, 4.6.3 for Font Awesome, 2.2.4 for jQuery. We're good to go. All right, so I'm saving everything. I'm going to go back to my terminal window, and now I'm going to initialize things. Initialize my GitHub. So I'll say git init. Now, here's a shortcut to git add dot, right? Normally, I would do this, git add dot, and then git commit minus m, blah, blah, blah. The shortcut is git commit minus a minus m, right? And then the name of the commit, which is initial commit. What does -a do? Git add dot, add everything, enter. Now, if you notice, it says untracked files. Those are the ones you want to untrack. Nothing added to commit, but untracked files present. Okay, so let's try this out. So git add dot, like I said before, right? -a is supposed to take care of that. Git commit, it's okay. -m, who cares? And then initial commit. Okay, clear screen. And let's go back to Git for a second and make a repository, right, that we're going to do. And I'm going a little faster than normal, but only because we don't have unlimited time, right? So we're just going to go to Centennial College, and we're going to add a new repository, COMP125, and we'll say, I'll say summer 2016 here. Lesson 10. Okay, clickety-click. We've made a repository. We're going to take the last two lines here, and we're going to connect it to our local repo. Okay, so we're good. So we'll clear this. And now we go back to Visual Studio Code, and we're good. Okay. So far, I mean, I haven't put it up on Azure every single time. Okay, like we go on Azure here and there just to show you the difference. We will be doing more Azure, and one of the things is this week, I want to point out that I want to go up on Azure and put up Ajax because we're going to be working with Ajax. Other things to note is this: in order for you to work with Ajax, you need to have a server. Okay, you can't do it. You can't run just double-clicking on indexed HTML anymore. Okay, with Ajax calls, you need to have a server. And that means we also, when we put up on Azure, there's also issues when you do Ajax with Azure. We're going to talk about that because it may not work properly. Okay, so you have to have something called a web config file that you have to put together in order for you to work with Azure. Every web provider has some other requirement when it comes to this kind of stuff because it could be a security issue. Here's one more thing that we're going to talk about. You can't write files from a client-side perspective. Okay, you cannot write files to the server, right, with JavaScript. Can't. You can read from the server, right, and all that kind of stuff, but writing to the server is a whole different thing, unless you have server-side technology to help you. Example, Node.js would be a good if you want to just use JavaScript, or PHP, or something like that. Some kind of server-side technology. Server-side technology, yes, you can write files. You can read files from the operating system with JavaScript, but you can never write files. Why? Security. Because imagine if I have some kind of client-side technology that I can write something on the back-end server, or talk about security, right? I can break the back-end server, right? Should never be able to do that. So you'll never have, so far as I can see, the ability for you to use front-side or client-side technology to write to a file. You'll be combining that with back-end technology like Node.js, PHP, something, in order for you to do that. Okay, so before we start. So we've set up our lesson. It's lesson 10. Let's test this out. So I'm going to use Light Server for this, Light Server. And again, if you can't get Light Server to work, it's okay. But we're talking about updating web pages with Ajax. Let's go inspect. And inside my inspect, I'm going to see that I got some failed to load resource, server responded with an error because my favicon isn't there. Let's kind of do that. And I've got some other stuff I got to clear. Notice that I have my app.js is not empty. We'll empty it out. So we're going to get rid of all this stuff inside our init. So here's all the stuff that was in our init. Let's get rid of it all. Okay, and save. Okay, so let's talk about this Ajax stuff. And I'm going to use the PowerPoint just as a reference card again. It's full of information. Am I going to use every piece of it? Absolutely not, right? And we're going to get to the pieces that I want to use fairly quickly. So stay with me. Okay, the idea that when we access a web page, all right, as an example, when we do any kind of access to the web page, we make a request to the server, right? I make a request in my URL, right? My universal resource locator. I want to locate some information, right? And I make a request to the server by putting in my address, my web address. The server makes a response based on your request. So there's request, response, right? Okay. The problem with making a request response all the time on a URL And if every time I click a button, it goes somewhere else to get data, as an example, and I have to reload the page itself, it takes an additional call and more time for it to load the page. And so we developed a system of, without loading the whole page again, I can load only part of the page, or I can load information from a file into the page. One thing that Ajax is really good to work with is exchange formats like JSON. We haven't talked about JSON too much, and XML. And there's a difference. We talked last week about strings, and there's some really cool, I talked about a couple of really cool methods we can use to change a JSON data into a string and change a string into JSON data, okay? We'll talk about that a little bit more today, right? Maybe next day. So the idea is, one of the things we have to do when we create an Ajax request, it's a different kind of request, is create something called an XML HTTP request object, or an XHR object, right? The idea of creating this object, when I say object, it is an object. It has methods attached to it. It has other things you can do with the XHR request. And again, this, guys, from a level of complexity today, is one of the most, we're getting more complex now as we enter different things, because when we talk Ajax, there's a lot more detail that we have to be aware of. All right, so please pay attention to this one, because this, you're going to need this for one of your next assignment. Okay. Okay, so the idea is, and by the way, please, whenever I see DHTML, I want to scream, right? DHTML, dynamic HTML. I don't like the word dynamic is really been overused over the last little while. You know, I mean, it gives you the idea that the page is more interactive, if you want to talk about. So from a user interactive perspective, it's more interactive, right? As opposed to dynamic. I think dynamic is a bad word, right? Because it's loaded. You have an idea in your head what it means, but it's not correct, right? Now here's an example. They gave an example of Google. When you start typing, you get you start pulling up information, the search suggestions that are automatically downloaded from the server based on the user search box, whatever you put in there, right? That's an example of Ajax at work. Why? I'm searching through stuff that already exists. You know, and you want to try and filter. It's not like, you know, an autocomplete. This is not the same thing. As I put I start putting my information into the search, you know, it starts trying to pare down already to get the right information for me, as opposed for me to wait for me to put my search in and then respond. It's going to respond already. It's already starting to cut down the search as I type, right? That's really cool, and Google makes use of that kind of technology. Ajax is also being used on Google Maps. All right, so if I look at Google Maps, let's take a look at a map of where we are. So if I go maps.google.com, right? And here, you know, we're going to try and figure out where I am. So again, let's say for an example, I'm going to say something like, you know, I want to go to Centennial College, right, on Progress, right? Okay, so here's my map. Now notice this is just a graphic, right? This is just a graphic. And this graphic, as I scroll out, you know, notice how the detail starts to change, right? Ajax at work. This is Ajax. So data is being loaded into my page, and I don't want to say dynamically, interactively, right? As I scroll, or it responds to what the user is doing on the page for data to be loaded. Ajax. Okay, that's what we're using for that. Okay. So whereas my page is not reloading, take a look at my page. My page doesn't reload. If I just scroll in and out, my URL doesn't change. Oh, now it did, right? But you can see that as I move closer, right, the details of my URL in terms of my location that I'm looking at. So whatever location I'm zooming in on, right, the exact geolocation on my URL changes, right? Again, it's happening interactively, or you might say dynamically. I want to strangle people who say dynamically all the time, but that's a good example of dynamic, right? Especially when I go and change views. And I want to, for example, if I take my little man here, and I want to search the, kind of go down into ground level, now I'll take a look up here, right? See how the URL just changed interactively, right? So we're looking at Centennial College, you know, and I want to walk through. I'm going to do a walkthrough of Centennial College, right? There we go. I kind of walk through the student center here, right? And just over here, and then here's my area. Now there's only so much I can go to. How come? How come I can't go over here? Well, because when Google took their pictures, as they didn't kind of drive through there. And some places, they prevent you from going through, right? But I can always do a zoom in, right? Here we go, zoom in. And I can even see the back of a student that was being filmed at the time, right? We don't know who it is. Things to note that Google does for us that protects us is things like license plates. You can't see a license plate. They've all been, by the way, this is machine learning they use for this, right? They do it so that way you can't see license plates, and they also gray out faces. So if I see somebody who's here, example would be this student. If I can go closer, they're gone now. But even if I zoom in, you can see that the face has been grayed out. All those faces have been gone. Those are all examples of machine learning and Ajax at work, right? So we use stuff, we use Ajax for different things. And this is a great example. Google Maps is a great example of Ajax, loading things in a page without me going into my URL or changing my my link at all. But the page gets changed. The information that comes up on the page here, it changes, and it changes the request that goes back to the server and loads up pieces of my page in real time. So great example, a really good example of that. So guys and girls, Ajax, really important to learn if you're doing JavaScript. CSS and HTML can't do Ajax for you. Okay, this is where we go beyond our progressive enhancement, right? Progressive enhancement, HTML5, good structure, CSS, you got good design. Now you need some kind of data. No. HTML5 and CSS, so they can't do it right now. All it can do is structure and presentation, right? And some animation and special effects and those kind of things. But it can't do data. Data, Ajax, JavaScript. Okay. And again, this idea of the request response. It does a round trip, right? The client, right, this is right from your book, goes in and makes a request to the server. Server processes a request and response, right? This standard HTTP request, it takes time because it's a round trip, right? This round trip, if I keep making round trips every time I click on the page, woo, people are going to be waiting, right? Especially if I have thousands of users doing this all at the same time on the same page. This is where you have a lot higher wait times. Imagine during registration periods here at the college, right? You're online doing web registration, and you all try and do it in the same window. There's a bit of a delay, right? In fact, I might say there's a big delay sometimes, right? And also sometimes the page doesn't work. You got to load it again, right? Why? Because we're hammering the server with requests over and over again. And that's why when we use Ajax, all right, the idea of making an XHR object, right? What we're doing is we're sending information and we're responding to the server, but we're not reloading the page, right? We're just filling the page with data, right, from the server. Same kind of idea of making a request, but we're opening and closing channels. All right, we talked about this. We can request data from the server, and if I was going to test you on this next week, because we're not going to test this week, but if I talk about testing, we can request data, can use a server-side script as a proxy to access data from another domain, no problem. But one of the problems is we cannot, write data to the, without any backend technologies. Okay, one of the two things we cannot do. Okay, I want to skip some of this stuff. Yes.
So as Google Maps are showing the class number and all those things, like the building type also, like first floor, second floor, third floor. All these things are working on like the
It's getting information from Ajax. Yeah, it's good. It's loading information in the page without reloading the page. Page not being reloaded, right? Popular web server software they talk about here on the back end, because remember, Ajax has to be hosted. Ajax files cannot be local. Can't just like double click on a file and all that kind of stuff. You have to be hosted somewhere. And they give some example of some popular server software: Apache, Nginx, that's a big one these days, with Nginx with Node.js as an example. IIS, right? So Apache, MySQL, PHP, that's a stack, the AMP stack. Nginx for, let's say, for example, using Node, the whole mean stack, Mongo, Express, Angular, Node, or something like that, a full stack using Nginx. And then, of course, you have the ASP.NET or .NET stack, which is IIS, Internet Information Services, with ASP.NET and some kind of MVC or something like that on the front end, right? And you can use Angular with that too. So really 3 popular stacks. There's also Java out there if you want to make a whole Java EE stack enterprise, right? There's also Python on the back end as well. You can use many web server technologies out there, but these 3 would be probably the 3 most popular ones, especially PHP. PHP is everywhere. Does it make it good? No. PHP sucks to work with, right? Because it's very unstructured, right? That's the problem with it. And although you can structure it, you can make it more structured. And Laravel is a great, way of structuring PHP to make it more object-oriented and use a whole MVC or three-tier structure. Still, I think PHP is becoming less and less popular, and what's happening more and more popular is technologies like Nginx with some kind of Linux server. Okay, let's go on. So you need some kind of server to host your request when it comes to Ajax. It can't just be done by double-clicking an index file. Okay, so let's talk about these 4 steps, because we're going to do these 4 steps. And if I ever ask you a question, what are the 4 steps? You need an XML HTTP request object, number 1. All right, if you don't have this, nothing happens. 2, you need to send a request with your XHR object, right? So 1 is you need the object. 2, you have to send a request. 3, receive the request, receive a response from the server, and deal with the data. And finally, process the data returned from the server and incorporate the data into your app or your page. Okay, that's what you do. So those 4 steps. It's almost like I have an object, make a request, comes back, and I got to do something with it, right? Typically, the round-trip stuff always happens on the back end, but we can use Ajax to do some kind of stuff that we think about is back end on the front end without going into the back end at all. Again, back end, I'm talking about server-side technologies. Yes?
So if we are using Ajax, is the Java code visible to like any other person?
JavaScript code is always visible, right? Yes.
Even if we are not using Ajax?
We'll talk about that after. I'll talk about. Yeah. Returning it back, again, I told you, you can't write to the server at all, right? Using front-end technologies. You have to use a back-end. You have to connect to the back-end somehow, right? So let's say, for example, you have a PHP to write data on the back-end. That makes sense if you want to have a PHP server. So a little PHP page to write to the server. Or maybe you have a Node.js app that also allows you to have a page to some controls that allow you to write stuff to the server with, let's say, for example, with MongoDB or something like that. Some kind of database, or there's got to be some kind of way of storing data. And the only way that you can do that is with server-side technology. But you can't send requests back to a file, right? A flat file, as an example, with front-end technology. You just can't do that, right? We're talking about just reading from information that already exists. So these are a couple of good slides to get you to understand the round trip and what happens. Again, the app uses an XHR request object, right? And then makes the request, the server processes the request, and then comes back with a response, right? And there's more complex stuff where you have XHR request, PHP server talks to a web service responds with more information, right? But again, you can use this very, very high level, and if you really want to get into it, you can certainly read more about it. I'm not going to go into too much detail here because we want to actually try it out, right? All right, so again, if you can take anything away from this one is this: request, response. Those are the 2 parts of any kind of URL. If I put something in something in my URL, www.example.com, that's my request. It goes out, server processes it, responds with a page, and renders the page in real time. That's what it does. Okay, I'm just going to keep going because you guys know a lot about this. I'm not going to go through this. HTTP messages, we're going to be talking about different message responses. So the server doesn't just respond by processing the page. The server also responds with messages, and usually the messages have a code. For example, 200, right? 200 means everything is okay, right? We're going to learn about those things. You need to understand what the message responses mean, right? And this is something cool. So it's important for us to understand what the messages are, because when you learn Node.js one day, and I'm hoping you all will, then you're going to get different responses, and you're going to sit there and go, what does this mean, this 304, right? You should know. What does a 404 know? You guys should all know what 404 means, right? Page not found, right? 404, right? That's a response that the server sends back to you if you're searching for a resource that doesn't exist, right? And there's different ways of doing that. The thing to notice is that you have a bunch of header lines in your file, and usually it's in the payload that comes back. It comes back with a bunch of header lines, right? There's a blank line, and there's the message body, right? Usually, typically, how it comes back. So there's the payload. Each payload of the message that gets sent out to the server has a bunch of stuff. It comes up with a specific format. Okay. So I make an HTTP request, and I have a payload. I want you to think about it almost like a missile being launched, right? The payload is in the front of the missile, right? Goes out to the server. The server takes the payload, reads it, and then responds with its response. Okay. Here's something to note. There's 47 HTTP 1.1 headers. 47. Do you need to know all these things? Absolutely not. You can look them up. I recommend if you get some kind of header response that you don't understand. We're going to talk about stuff that makes sense to us. Okay. So what's caching? Pages cache information all the time, and a cache is a bunch of information that the page is storing, so that it doesn't have to make another server request. Especially if it's something that's being served up over and over again. A good example of that is, well, think about a content delivery network. Who knows what a content delivery network is? A CDN. Anybody? You guys should have heard of this. And if I was to go to that for a second. So if I look at CDN, what's a CDN, right? On Wikipedia, it basically is, this is a great little picture. Here's an example of a single server distribution idea, right? So I have one server, distributes the information to different requests, right? Well, this information is not being cached. But what if I have the information distributed to different servers, so the same information being distributed to different servers. So now I don't have one server dealing with all those requests. I have a bunch of servers just reading out the same requests that I'm getting for that one piece of information. Example would be jQuery, right? Or some popular library out there. If you use the CDN in production, right? What it does is the CDN is distributed amongst different servers. Then if you go with your website, with your web browser to a website that you've already seen, a library like jQuery 2.2.4, instead of you having to download it directly from the server, in this particular case, only this server has it, right? You already have it, and it's cached in your browser, so you don't have to download it. So it speeds up download times, right? It's cached in your browser, the whole library, right? As an example. Or it's cached here locally on the server, and the server is closer to you. It could be closer to you because it might be localized compared to a server that's centralized somewhere in the world, right? One centralized server, you might have different response times depending where you exist. Lots of servers with a distributed network, within a distributed network, you can have the same information that's more local to you, so make it to fast response times. And further than that, you can store common libraries in your browser, so if you go there over and over again, you already have that library, you don't have to reload it, right? Caching. Yeah.
So when we are using some kind of websites, they like give a pop-up that we are using cookies. So
yes.
what's the difference between these?
Cookies are a way of storing information about on your browser, right?
Cookies are hidden, not hidden. Like we cannot retrieve data from the cookie.
You can retrieve data and store data on the cookie, yeah. But cookies aren't secure. Cookie is bad, right, for security. Cookies are there just to store temporary data. So you don't want your credit card information being stored in a cookie. That would be bad. Someone can go on your web browser, open it up, look at it, and see all the information. Even if it's encrypted in some ways, doesn't matter. Let me continue. So the idea of caching, right, is this way it removes the need for us to go back to the server over and over again, right? But caching goes against the reason for using AJAX, like it says, right? AJAX and caching are kind of against each other. right? What Ajax doesn't cache. Ajax goes out and grabs information to, and pops it into your page as you need it, right? By the way, most modern front-end frameworks like Angular, as an example, use jQuery and Ajax, some kind of jQuery Lite and Ajax, right? Okay. One thing to note is the most common HTTP request we can make is GET and POSTs. Okay, so if I was going to say, what's the most common HTTP requests? GET and POSTs. So when I want to read a page, it's a GET request. Okay. Again, you need to know this from if you ever do any kind of more in-depth web stuff, right? If you don't know GET and POST, something's not right. We haven't taught you properly, right? So again, I read a page, I do a GET request. I write to a page, or I click the submit button in a form. Now I'm doing a POST request because I'm taking my form data and I'm sending it to the server. That's something that I'm doing. I'm posting that information. There's other ones as well. Most modern ones are delete or put. Delete is used to remove data from a server, right? So we make a delete request to the server. And usually goes back to the server, by the way. It doesn't happen without the server, right? Put is usually used to update information. So if I want to do an update, so here's full CRUD for you, right? Create, read, update, delete. I want to create something, I use a POST request. If I want to read something, I use a GET request. If I want to update something, I use a PUT request. If I want to delete something, I use a delete request, right? Those are the different kinds of requests you can send off. Remember, it's all request response, right? And I'm usually going to get a response in terms of the server's going to respond by rendering information on my page, right? So it's going to put my page, display my page information that I'm based on my response or my request. Okay, we talked about this. Let me just talk more about some other stuff here. This is neat. This information here it all comes from our host, our HTTP request. For example, if I want to know what the referrer is, right, or the user agent, we've talked about this actually when we looked at the document object model, the DOM, the BOM, and all that stuff. We talked about this. The referrer itself is the URL from which the request was made. So example, if I want to know the referrer address, let's say, for example, I'm on the home page, my index.html page on a site. So www.example.com/index.html. And then I want to go to my about page, about.html, right? The referrer is the fully qualified domain, www.example.com/index.html. That's the referrer when I go to my about page. If I click the nav bar and there's a link there to go to my about page, that's the referrer. The user agent usually talks about the web browser. And a lot of times we use user agent strings to identify whether the browser is a mobile browser or a regular desktop browser, okay, or a tablet browser. You can get the user agent information, basically tells us, hey, and think about the user agent, the agent of the user. The browser is an agent of the user, right? It's the way that the user gets information, right, through the browser. Or some kind of other software. You don't have to get information through a browser. You can also use like an application to get information from a website, right? Or a bot getting information from a website too, if you're thinking about security, right? Lots of bots out there. So when we send HTTP requests, again, this is all information about that's contained in the header, okay? So the header can contain a lot of information about who's sending, what we're sending, what's the request type, and all that kind of stuff. I'm not going to go into too much detail here. But the great thing is to understand that all these things, if you really wanted to study, there's enough information here that if you wanted to go into it, you could learn. I mean, you could spend a week just looking at this stuff. Like literally, there's so much stuff here. And we're just going to scratch the surface again. Yes. We're going to talk about Ajax, a good example of Ajax in a second. But first I want to talk about, just generally request response. So we need to do a little bit of, I hate to say this, theory about this one because this is a little bit theory heavy, this part, right? Okay. So we're going to get status codes back. When we make a request, like I said, you're going to get a code. Usually if the 100s of stuff back is usually some kind of, informational stuff back that says, yeah, your request has been received, right? 200s, you're going to get success messages back. Yes, we've received a request. Thank you very much, sir, or you know, miss, and we're going to send back some information. A 300 or 3XX kind of request is it can't be completed without some kind of further action. For example, you know what? Nothing's been done. We're waiting for you to update. You know, we need to get some information for you or whatever. And then some kind of 400 error or 500 error, usually some kind of error. Like it's really an error. Anything 400 and above typically is something that response from the server saying there's a problem. Yeah. Usually the client request has to be fixed somehow, right? It could be because it's a malformed request, or maybe the information is missing, or you know, they haven't put in the, you know, they've clicked on the wrong link, or they've entered something on the URL manually to try and break you. By the way, remember that users don't always have to follow you know, links, right? If your URL displays sensitive information, they can take that URL information, modify it a little bit, and try and break your system, right? And especially if it takes things like information about ID and so on, I can go in and put up my own URL ID or try and inject other kinds of things to mess with your backend code, to break your server. And a lot of times, if you're not careful, it will break your server, especially node servers. Node servers I can break, you know, 2 seconds if they're not secure. So these are examples of some, you know, you know, URL or header responses. And again, this one here, I guess I should have probably put this on the other side. But more or less, like I said, 100, 200, 300s, 400s, and 500s. 400s and 500s are some kind of errors. You want to get 200s for your response. So 200, if you get a code 200, everything's okay. The request was successful. We're going to look for those things. So I'm going to test for that. So here's my if statement. If my response or the response code that I get back is 200, right? Means that everything's okay. And my status code is something else. We're going to talk about the status codes in a second, right? Then load the page, load the information. How about if I get a 301, right? 301 means, hey, you know what? You're trying to get to a URL that doesn't exist anymore, and it's moved, right? 302, it's only temporarily moved. It's temporarily down. 304, nothing happened, and you know what? Nothing's modified. You've asked me for the same page twice. We've made a callback request for the page, but you've already got the information. So I'm not going to load you. I'm not going to give you anything extra, right? And it can tell if I've already asked for the same and the information hasn't changed. If I click on refresh on an index.html page, but nothing's changed, I'm going to get a 304, right? It's not an error. It's just a status code that says, hey, nothing's changed, right? 404, again, not found, and 500, some kind of internal error. This is the worst kind of error you can get. If I get a 500 error, usually the server's down, right? Or I can bring the server down with enough of these. Okay. I'm not going to talk about this too much. So again, we're going to talk more about the XML HTTP request object in a second, because this is the key to incorporating AJAX into your JavaScript. And here are some built-in methods we're going to look at. Abort, get all response headers. You can do that, get all response headers. The open method we're going to use today, and the send method we're going to use. Okay? So again, we have to use the open method to open up a particular resource, and the send method to send information, and hopefully we'll receive a request, a response from the server that's positive. Okay. Here are the events, and this is very, very important. I want to look at on-ready state change. So when it specifies the name of the event handler function that executes whenever the ready state property value changes. And there's different ready states. For example, the ready states are 0, uninitialized, 1, open, 2, sent, 3, received, and 4, loaded. So if I get a ready state of 4, and an HTTP response of 200, that means everything is okay and I got my data. When those two things are good, then I can use the data. And I want to wait till that's done. Why? Because if I try and use data while I'm still downloading information, I'm going to get an error, right? Think about it as me trying to load an image from the web, right? The image doesn't happen automatically. It happens when the image is done, then I want to render my page. I don't want to render my page until the image is finished, right? Sometimes what you'll get is the image being loaded and the page rendering slowly, 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 right? Well, that is in the process of loading or setting up the image. You can stop it and say, okay, don't put the image on the page until I have the image, right? So I preload my image up first. When I'm done, spit it out to the page, right? And then you won't see, you know, in steps usually to load the image. So status codes are really, really important. And the ready state is you're going to combine the ready state with one of these status codes, for example, 200, with a ready state of, like I said before, of 4, typically. When you have the ready state of 4, you know everything's good, and you can use the data. So it's everything's OK, plus I have the data. Let's use the data. OK? Yeah. JSON, usually typical. We can use, there's no file extension. You can use JSON data, XML data, HTML data, whatever you want. No. OK. Here's how we make the constructor. So let's start coding. All right. So I'm going to use this. Oops. I'm going to go back here and I'm going to make a new HTTP request. It is this new HTML request object. OK. So let's do this first piece. So I'm going to go into my code. And here inside my init function, I'm going to say start typing so far. Well, we're going to call, instead of an HTML HTTP object or whatever, we're going to say XHR, right? XML HTTP request object, right? And that equals to what? Right? If you look back, a new XML HTTP request object. So I'm going to start typing XML HTTP request. Woo! Right, now, once I've done this, this is step 1. Remember we talked about this? Step 1. Create the object, right? No object, no communication with the back end, right? All right, cool. If you look at this, if I hover over it, my XHR, it says any. Even though this one here is a new object. Okay, here's something that I missed. New keyword. If I don't use the new keyword, right, I can't create an object. See, new. Now if I hover over it, I get a new XML HTTP request object, XHR, right? Again, if I look over this, the XML HTTP request object, it is the object that has many, many methods built into it, which we're going to use. An example of this, if you want to know what they are, if I go XHR dot, you can see that there's a bunch of methods that I can use, right? So you can go down here, response text, the response type. Response text we're going to use because response text is going to tell us what we get from the response body. These are things that are built in as properties. And then we have our send request. That's a method. And there's also an open request. If you look at open, here's the open method. So there's open and send, and we can check on ready state and so on. This is all built into our XHR object. Again, we're thinking about an object as it's based on a class, the XML HTTP request class that's built into JavaScript, right? And so the XHR object gives us a bunch of stuff that's loaded from our class. Yes?
So we can write these kind of Ajax coding in PHP also?
No. Typically, we wouldn't do that. We would do it with JavaScript. Yes, you could, but why? If I have PHP, I would just use backend technologies, right? XHR or Ajax is a front-end technology, right, to use. Okay, here. So I've got my HTTP request, blah, blah, blah. Now, what they do here is they establish in the book and other places, they establish this idea of a get request object function, okay? And what they're trying to do here is they say, hey, let's make this HTTP request, right, into this new object, okay? Instead of doing what I did, right, var, HTTP, blah, blah, XHR, right? And then what they're going to say is they make a try-catch. Okay, by the way, we've done, who knows about try-catch? Try-catch is around exception handling, right? To make sure we don't get an error. Because if I don't do a try-catch around my object, there's a possibility that it's going to shut me down. That my page will crash completely, right? So remember what we do. In the try area, we try and make a new request. Why? Because depending on the browser may not support an XML HTTP request, especially older Internet Explorer type browsers, right? If you're using IE as an example, you cannot use XML HTTP request the way we have it written here. There is another way of doing it as an example with IE, right? Which I'm not going to detail here. because most modern browsers will use this. Do I have to do it here because I'm using a Chrome or Firefox or even Edge? No, you're okay. You don't have to do it. But if you're using an older browser, the recommended method is to wrap everything in a try-catch, so that way it doesn't crash. Because if I try and do this, where XML HTTP request, the object doesn't exist on that particular browser platform, it'll just crash. And it'll crash silently. Remember, JavaScript fails silently. There is no error, right? It's not gonna, your just page won't load. You'll be like, well, I don't know what's happening, right? So you need to create that. And this is why you catch the request error. And if the request error, as an example, it's loaded with information, you can kind of pump out saying something like, your browser does not support this content, right? So again, do we want that situation? Am I going to be backwards compatible enough to care about older browsers? You know what, guys? Absolutely not. We have no time for that. What was that? No, I'm just saying. It's just, I don't. You know, I'm not going to. At this point, we're not going to talk about older browsers beyond IE6 and IE7. Okay. Most modern computers use IE10 and higher, right? So we don't have to worry about these things. But if you want to know, if you want to say XML HTTP request from a from a support perspective, and if I go to caniuse.com, caniuse.com is a really cool resource like that. And if I go to JavaScript, and if I script down here, you can see way down on the bottom, with XML HTTP request, right? Not just advanced features, but if I just put XML HTTP request, you can see that, where it's supported, right? Opera Mini, no, none of them supports it. But most modern browsers, even IE 11 and higher, is good. You have partial support. This is for advanced features, right? So it says adds more functionality to XHR. What if I just want to talk about, if I go XHR here, right? Or XML HTTP request, right? So you can see the support that you get across, different browsers, right? So one thing that it won't allow us to do, again, we cannot, for the most part, 92%, by the way, available even for the advanced features, right, with Ajax. Look what it says: uploads, transfer progress information, and the ability to send data. This is, usually it says previously known as XML HTTP request level 2. These features now appear simply in the XML HTTP request spec. So not only can I can upload data, I can upload, like uploads and all those kind of things, upload pictures and all that kind of stuff. But most modern browsers support it, except for Opera Mini, right? Okay, still, I want you to think about it for now in this version of HTML right now as you can't write to a file with Ajax. Okay, you can read from a file, but you can't write. Just for now, I want you still to think about it, even though it's supported and you can use advanced features here like it says. And it's supported, from a global perspective, around 92% globally, right? I still recommend don't think about it as possible. Okay, let's go back. So this, do I need this right now? Hell no, don't do this, right? Yes, it's nice and safe. Yes, you'll be able to support other browsers and older browsers. But for the most part, anything beyond IE10, you're good, right? So are we going to try and here's the question. If you go to a shop and they say, we're going to support all browsers, as old as IE3. The amount of work that's involved that we're talking about is huge, okay? It's crazy, right? And that is something that I have to understand there's got to be a real reason why, the client wants that kind of support, right? Why do they want support? Do they have older systems in their shop that they want to support? Or is it something that internal, they don't know what kind of systems that are gonna the information that's so important on their website, they must have every system access to it? If that's the truth, then you may have to support older browsers. Where's a case like that? Things like any kind of emergency information. You can see that they have a lot of support for older browsers because you don't want to say, well, they're accessing my support page, my emergency page, but you know what? You don't have a modern browser, so too bad, die, right? So there you might have some support for older browsers, right? Some emergency stuff. For the most part, and also if you want to give a client experience to more people, to open up the market to more browsers. But for the most part, most of our browsers, you support Ajax out of the box, yeah. government websites, they do a lot more earlier support stuff, but even further back than this. So then you would have to use this try-catch system. For me, for what I'm going to ask you to do for your assignment, you don't need to use try-catch for the XML HTTP request part. Okay? Just do what I'm telling you. You'll see. All right. There's some information here on slide 33. There's some information about the different objects. One of the things is it really depends on the data source, right? So, for example, if I use a JSON object, information stored in a JSON object, JSON is one of the most popular formats for data exchange. Okay, nowadays. Okay, especially when it comes to API, right? So if I have an API, a web API, a service on the background, we use JSON objects, right, that are sent into the browser, right? So the browser will have a bunch of what looks like gobbledygook that comes back. If you actually go to that website, if you can access the website without logging in, you'll see a bunch of JSON data, an API we're talking about, right? Okay, let's keep going. So when we create an AJAX call, typically we have to access something on the back end. And a lot of times we use JSON. So that's why I'm focusing on JSON for this one. Not because we can't access XML, which is also a very popular format, or even HTML. You can actually get information from HTML. Okay? This is what JSON looks like. We've kind of seen this before, right? This is JSON. Okay? Does it look like something we've seen before? Like an object. It's not an object. It looks like an object, not an object. This is JSON. And the reason why I'm putting it out there is because it's a little bit different. Not only is it an object, it looks like an array of objects, right? Here's a square bracket, right? Let me just go focus in there so you can see it better. Look, here's a square bracket, and this is an address book. You've got a name, right? And an email. Those two properties, name and email, are part of this object that's inside of an address book, the address book array. So it contains an array, right, of objects. I also want you to think about this information here, stored in an array, as a document. This is the JSON document. And notice that it starts with a curly brace. So always, 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 JSON documents start with a curly brace and end with a curly brace. This is proper JSON, right? And you have some kind of information that's stored in there that I can access. Okay. How do I access JSON data? Yes? Which one? Application programming interface. Typically, when I have an application programming interface to access data, right, there's some kind of set of classes and methods that I'm going to use to access data or access a particular programming interface. For example, if I make a programming interface that gives you access to address book information, there might be methods and classes for you to access the address book information that's going to be built around an XHR object, all right? Usually, some kind of open and closing kind of information, okay? The format, the data exchange format that we're using, right? Because this is data coming from a server, right? The data exchange that's the most popular out there is JSON, JSON. That's the way we say it. And actually stands for JavaScript Object Notation. Okay, that's what it comes with. So it looks like an object, not an object. It's JSON. JSON is a data internet exchange format, right? Okay, let's go back. So here's the way it works. AJAX talks to the server. The server doesn't talk to AJAX. This is important to note that. So I talk to the server with AJAX. All right? Because of this, AJAX does two things. Sends a request, processes the data, right? Okay. Again, we're going to use the open method that's part of the XHR object to open up a channel that we can communicate with the server. Okay, that's what we're going to do. I'm going slow like this, and you might say, Tom, why is it going so slow? Why don't we just go faster? Because you have to know these are all the piece parts to this whole request, right? And otherwise, I'm going to put some stuff together. You're going to ask me all these questions anyway. What's open? What does it do? Blah, blah, blah. So again, it accepts 3 optional arguments. Async. What's async? Async, yeah. What is it? It's not a sink where you pour drinks, right? What is it? What is it? Asynchronous. It's asynchronous, right? Asynchronous means it doesn't have to wait, right? So here's the thing. Normally, if I make a synchronous response, a request, so let's say I'm going to send you a request. It's like making a phone call. I'm going to make a request to you, and you're going to answer the request. But guess what? If he makes a request to you, and and while I'm on the phone with you, right? You know what's going to happen to him? He's going to get a busy signal, right? Because my request has to finish synchronously before his request can fire. That's how it works. Synchronous. Is that good? No, right? Because that means that people are waiting for a response. You're waiting, right? Synchronously. If I make asynchronous requests, still the same thing is going to happen. I'm going to make a call to you. He's going to call you. Then you're going to get a beep, beep, call waiting, right? When you're done with my little conversation, or even if you're not done, you're going to put me on hold for a second, answer his, actually the way it should work in this analogy is you're going to make a clone of yourself, and now you're going to respond to him as well, right? So you're going to start responding. So my request doesn't have to finish before you respond to his request. Okay, here's the other thing. I don't even have to wait for the response to happen. I make a request, right? And I can make another request and another request and another request, 5 requests in a row, and I don't have to wait for the request to happen. That's asynchronous. There's dangers to this. Yes? No, because you're still going to get a synchronous request response. For example, in a messaging environment. If I start typing to you, right? So I got my messaging app. Let's say I use some kind of iMessage, and you have an iPhone too. Let's just say you have an iPhone too, and I'm sending a message to you, or SMS, sending a message to you. At the same time I send a message to you, send a message back. What happens? If I send the message before you do, it's going to appear higher than yours. But yours is going to come back before I've actually sent the message. But still, the message is going to be out there. Sometimes we'll ask the question, like, for example, hey, where are you? So I'm typing, where are you? Meanwhile, you send a message to me saying, I'm right next to you, before I've even sent the message to you, right? Hey, man, where are you? Or we might both ask the question, where are you? Meanwhile, we're 2 seconds away from each other, right? We look around the corner, and you ever have that information where you're typing and you're seeing the person right there, you type, they type, and they get their message to you before you actually get their message to them. Or you're thinking about responding with your information, and they're already sent the message to you. It can be networking, but I want you to think about asynchronous as I don't have to wait for a response. I'm going to send out the message, and I don't have to wait for a response. I'm not going to block other responses. Asynchronous methodology is non-blocking syntax, which means I'm not going to wait for the message to finish or block other messages before my message completes. That's what I want you to think about it. And I'll tell you right now, Node.js and JavaScript can utilize both methods. There's methods that exist, synchronous and asynchronous, and you can choose which one. Now here's the danger. If I send an asynchronous request, right, I have to also have an event listener to listen for the request to complete. Because if I don't listen for my request to complete and I assume it's done, I'm going to get an error. Request never finished. But meanwhile, I'm trying to access the information that I think I got, but I didn't get it yet, right? I'm going to get an error on the page, or page is not going to load properly, right? So you have to wait for the data to finish loading, and then you can do that. But meanwhile, you can send as many requests as I want. I can send 10 requests, right? And part of my page will start loading at different stages, because when it's done loading, it's going to display. And so you see sometimes the page kind of goes like this and loads up different places, right? It's because we're making a synchronous request to the server. That could be one of the reasons. Whew. All right, so here's something. So once we make a request, the request is the XHR object, right? And when I have my XHR object, I want to use the open method of the XHR object to get a GET request, and I want to access the data from a specific place, like context.json. So before we go to break, just bear with me here. Let's create a context.json file, right? Just like we saw earlier. So here's our context.json with an address book, right? And I'm also gonna just twist this week and also use an actual object. So what's my object? My contact object. I have a contact object, right? My contact object I'm going to make as a contact class. right? My contact that's inside my address book. Okay, so let's think about this, and we'll see how we can use this thing. But first, let's get this copied into our page, and I'll show you the dangers of this. So first, we need a place to store this, and I'm going to store my JSON data in the root of my file, my folder. So I'm just going to do this. I'm going to kind of create a new object, and we're going to call this, we're going to call this thing like address book, right? .json, right? Because it's a JSON object, it's going to request, it's going to think about that you need an open and closing brace. That's the first thing. Next, notice that everything in JSON data, all right, when we talk about JSON data, has to be in quotations, all right, everything. And it has a colon that separates the object, all right? So if I do address book, that's my object, my array, colon, and then square brackets tells me address book is an array of something. We don't know what it is yet. Nope. There's no data types in JavaScript. Basically what it is just number or string or whatever. And right now, I want you to think about JSON as data. We don't know what it is yet. Okay, next. Name and email. Those are the two properties. So I have name and colon, and then the name in quotations again. By the way, you cannot use single quotes with JSON. All double quotes, all right? So if I type in the name of my object, notice that there's double quotes, and the name is, Tom, right? And the next one is, and I want you to see this for a second, because if you notice there's colon, right? And then the email was the next piece. So here's email, right? Hold on, I'm going to show you this, and we're going to talk about why we're getting errors in a second, right? Because remember, we're talking about thing, and here's my email address, so tom@example.com, right? So we got errors in my JSON. Why are we getting errors? It says, if I hover over it, expected comma or closing bracket, okay? Do I have a missing closing bracket or a comma anywhere? Here's my comma. Huh? What is it? Where?
Starting at writing before writing.
Well, I've got this, and oh yeah, hey, I can't store it like this, right? Because this is a property. I just can't store a property in an array. It's an array of objects. So I need a curly brace here, right? And I need a closing curly brace here, right? The closing curly brace talks about this object that's inside of my array, right? It's always going to give you, right, what you need to make up this thing. So this is a different format that we've seen before, right? Let's do it again. Let's say call comma where we format this thing, and let's add some other names in here into my address book. Okay, so we're going to say one. Doesn't really care, right? Because JSON doesn't care what you put in it. You can copy the same data over and over again. And so we have a few, 4. Let's see how many we have. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Let's say 5. One more. Here's 5. All right. So instead of me being all the same name, let's make up some names here. So we'll say, I don't know. I've used these names before. Please forgive me if I'm using common, Canadian names. It's not for. I'm not trying to be, prejudiced in any way. So Mary, we'll say Mary Jones. Actually, let's say Jessica Jones, just because she's a favorite character of mine, right? Jessica Jones. So we'll say maybe it's just Jessica. We'll only have one person named Jessica at example.com. Let's just say, right? And Bruce Wayne. I like that one. Bruce Wayne. Bruce Wayne, right? Bruce Wayne, Batman, right? Bruce. And let's see, I'm very Canadian. That's right. And let's. I'm with a bunch of superheroes here, right? Clark Kent. Clark Kent. Right. So we got Clark. Right. Clark there, right? Sure, Peter. I like Peter Parker. It's good, Peter Parker. And Tom Ziopoulos is one of our superpower he has, right? Peter Parker. Peter. So we have a bunch of names in our database, and actually this is like a database because our address book.json is a file, right? So now, what I want to do, the next part that I want in my app.js, right, is I want to use. If I go script down to the code here, I want to use. I'm just following the code. So I'm on page 38 of our PowerPoint. If you want to follow along, before I break, I want to use this request.open method, right? And I'm going to make what type of request? A GET request. Means I want to read from the server, right? Remember, read, create, read, update, delete. right? I can't make a post to the server because I don't have a backend server right now. I just have a simple little light server that I'm using, right? So what am I loading? And then we have to think about what this true means in a second. Let's talk about this. So again, I make an open request. And then it says the method string. So what is it? Get. That's the get method. Then the URL string. So where am I getting it from? I can use another URL instead of the. Remember, we have to be careful about that XHR or cross-site scripting. It might not like what you're looking at. But let's say I want to look at. Okay, I'm in app.js. How do I get to my JSON data? Right. So my JSON data in my address book. Right. It's inside my scripts. Right. It's in my scripts. Do I have to go up and down in scripts, or can I just go addressbook.json? Probably just addressbook.json, right? So let's just type it in. So say addressbook. If I can type, addressbook.json. That's the name of the file or the URL, right? That I'm getting. And then the next one is, it says async. So I want to make it async, true or false. And notice that there's a question mark. Async means that I don't want to wait, right? And then if I want to, optional username and password, right? Because maybe I want to pass in credential information to the server so that I know I can make the request, that I'm a validated or authenticated user. In this particular case, we don't care about that. We're going to say true. True means it's async. I'm using a synchronous methodology to get the data from the file. Okay, cool. So I've done that. Let's take a look and see if I get an error just by doing this. If I look at my light server is still running, right? And I'm going to make an XHR request, and we're going to open the channel. Let's see what I'm getting from my server. So if I right-click and go inspect, right, I can see if I got an error. No error so far. If I refresh, no error. Okay. If I was going to get an error, and if I didn't see this, if this was wrong, it would give me an error. Like example would be if I went up one. And then down to address book, it doesn't exist, right? And if I save this and go back and I refresh, hey, look, I'm not getting an error still. What's going on? Just saying, right? It fails nice and silently. So we don't know if even this XHR open request even worked. Okay, let's check. Let's go to the next stage before we go on. And then I'll pause. So again, the open takes 3 arguments, right? The other 2, right, are optional arguments, username and password. Boolean is for asynchronous. We want to use asynchronous. We've done that already. And we're going to, again, we're going to look inside of our data context. They say context.json. We called it addressbook.json as an example. And let's make sure that it's called the right thing. So addressbook.json, here it is. And it's in the same folder as our scripts folder where our app.js is. And it says, if it's a local file like ours, the path is relative to the HTML document you're using it, not the JavaScript file. Uh-oh, that's a problem. That means that even though my address book is inside my scripts folder, it's wrong because it's relative to my HTML document, right? So if I go to my HTML document, it's going to be under where? Scripts, addressbook.json, right? Because that's where my address book lives, not my this piece here, which is my app.js. It's not local to app.js. It's local to or relative to my index.html. Okay, that's 2. Synchronous or asynchronous. We're making it synchronous because or asynchronous because we don't have to wait for the request to complete. All right, and it also talks here if you want to read it about sending credentials with your username and password. Okay, we're not going to do that right now. Okay, so we've done our open. Now the next one is to send a send method, right? Again, we're going to submit the request to the server. Okay. By the way, the post requests are more involved, right? But remember, we need some kind of back-end server to respond to a post. We don't have a back-end server right now. All we have is a little server that's going to give us our information, right? Let's continue. We've done our request, our open. Now we're going to get a send. So request send is the next one. That's the initiate the call. These are the 4 steps we talked about, right? First, we declare the object, then we open, then we send, and we got to do something with it, right? And by the way, you can send a request. It says, or initiate the call with some kind of data. We're sending data to the server. For now, right now, we're not going to send any data to the server, so we're going to send no, right? Which looks funny when we do it. So XHR send, and if you open it up, it says, what kind of data do you want to send to the server? And the answer is, I don't want to send anything. So let's send null. Right, there we go. That's the next request. Let's go back to our page, and as we refresh, we can see again, there's no error. Right? Doesn't mean anything, by the way. Just telling you, there's no error on the page so far. All right, so we've done the request. As an example, we've got the request objects done. We've sent it. You can actually send a search if you want, right, to filter the item by hill. We don't want to do that right now. As an example, we can do that later. And we have some kind of response, right? We get a response in our thing. We get two things. The response XML property contains the HTTP request as an XML object, right? Or we can get the response text property, which contains the HTTP response as a text string. That's what you want, right? So that's what this one right here, as a string. Okay, cool. And remember we talked about ready state. We want to wait till the ready state is complete, right? And that we get a code of 200, right? So we're going to make a new, whatchamacallit, a new event object. So where the XHR on ready state change, right? And if you notice, is equal to a function, anonymous function, right? That's what we're going to point to. Now notice, on ready state change, right? Can we write this on ready state change differently? Add event listener, right? Ready state change. That's what would be remember, we take the on away, and we can write an event listener, because I don't really like this thing. And then when we're done, it says, check to see if the request object, whatever the request we get, here's a request, is the ready state is 4. 4 meaning it's complete, right? When it's complete, do something. Okay, good. And this is how we're going to structure our code in a second. Okay. Now here's the other one. We want to wait till, like we said, all is well, 200, right? So we want to make sure all is well, and our state change, our state says is 4. When those two things are good, we've got our data and it's ready, then we can do something with it. We know that we got the data back. Okay. So here's more of a complete code, right? So if my ready state change, as an example, is 4 and my request status is equal to 200, we're going to use this on ready state change object for this. And we're going to do this as soon as we make our XHR object, right? We're going to pump out the request.response text right to the console. Other than that, everything we've done so far is ready, right? So let's make this on ready state change. And we'll use the same syntax, and we'll rewrite it after, all right? So again, instead of doing the open, notice we're doing the open down here, and then we're making the object up here. By the way, it doesn't really matter where you make it, but we could do this one. So we're going to say xhr.onReadyStateChange. The onReadyStateChange says when we get the ready state change event happening, we want to point it to a new anonymous function, right? And the new anonymous function is going to do something. We're going to check to see if our xhr.readystate, right, is exactly equal to 4, right? That's what it says here to do, right? So we're checking this, and our request.status, so xhr.status, is exactly equal to 200. So and xhr.status is exactly equal to 200. So those are the two things we want to check. And I like putting these two things, by the way, just saying, in brackets of their own. Oops. Because it makes it clear for me what I'm doing. So if this is true, then what can I do? I want to do something, right? And what I want to do here is I want to console out my request.response text. So console log and xhr.response text. There it is. Okay, so what this does, it's going to read from the file, and if we're successful, we're going to read this file, right? And when the state changes, and the state changes 4 and 200, by the way, we could have written this somewhere down here too, right? Then we can load we can display this stuff, this information, only when everything's finished loading. Okay, let's see if that works. So we're going to go back to this, and we can see that we got the object. Make sense? By the way, before I break, let's take a look at this. Here's my network, right? And you can see this is very interesting, what you can see on the network side of things. And this is right inside my browser. So we're going to open this up so you can see it more. This is, I guess, the best you can see. All right, let's take a look at this. So here's the page loading. So localhost, we're going to get a 304. Nothing's changed, right? That's what it means, right? Not modified. If I hover over, it tells me the code too. And then as we get closer to the bottom, it gives me this 304, not modified, right? In my app.js, right? But we're going to get somewhere where we made the request. We made a GET request, right, for the object, right? Somewhere down in the bottom where we want to do an async request for the object to load it up, right? And again, notice that this is Open Sans. What's Open Sans? Open Sans is a Google font that we're looking at, and that's the most time it's taking right now. Here's something also, WebSockets, and down here is our transfer protocol, right? But you can see that if I click on XHR, right? So here's all our XHR objects, right? So browser sync client 2.1, and you can see if I hover over this, all the different requests. Request create, request, XHR, and then it goes through its process until we get a 200. A 200 means everything's okay. Let's refresh the page and see what we get here. And you can see that what's going on here in our request. Our GET request, right, as an example, it comes back, and we get our response. Here's the console. So this is all the information. Now, by the way, this all came back to me as a string. Can I use it right now? Use this object as a string. And the answer is no. We cannot use this object as a string. We have to convert it with, if I want to stringify, I turn it into a string. If I want to parse.json, I turn it into an object. So I want to convert it back into an object so I can use the data. Otherwise, right now, my data is useless. It's just a string. It's XML. It's just a nice, pretty way of writing the JSON that came from the file. Now remember, you can access different things, and when we come back from break, I'm going to show you how to access things not just from a JSON file, but from XML as well as from HTML, which is really key into creating a way of loading parts of your page at the same time, or creating partial pages. Okay, let's take a short break.